Hey everyone, welcome to the channel where I share creepy and scary stories that will give you chills. If you love horror and spooky tales, make sure to subscribe and join me every week for a new story. Let's get into the dark side together. The first sound was a hollow thud. Daniel froze in his living room, his television humming quietly. Forgotten. It came again, thud, 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 a fist pounding against it upstairs. He lived on the third floor of the old apartment block, and that sound was unmistakably from the fourth. His upstairs neighbor, Mr. Kovacs, had always been odd, a man in his late 50s, thin as a rail, always mumbling to himself in the stairwell. For the past week, Daniel had noticed him growing worse. Paler, darker circles beneath his eyes, whispering things Daniel couldn't quite make out. Tonight, though, the man wasn't whispering. He was shouting, "Open it!" The scream rattled the pipes in the ceiling. Then more pounding, violent now, like Kovacs was throwing his entire body against the door. Daniel grabbed his phone. He debated calling the landlord first, but something in Kovacs' voice, desperation, madness, maybe both, pushed him toward the police. His thumb hovered over 911, but then the lights in his apartment flickered. Once, twice, and the pounding upstairs stopped. The silence was worse than the noise. Daniel pressed his ear to the ceiling. He could hear something faint, scraping, wet, like nails dragging through plaster. He backed away, trying to calm his racing heart. That's when the hall outside erupted in shouts. A neighbor's voice, then another, panic in their tones. He opened his door and peered into the corridor. Mrs. Alvarez from 2B was clutching her robe, her eyes wide. "It's Kovacs," she whispered. "He's gone mad. He's bleeding all over the hallway upstairs." The building's old wiring made the emergency lights cast everything in a dull, sickly yellow. Shadows stretched unnaturally long across the walls. Daniel swallowed hard. "Did anyone call police?" he asked. "I did," Mrs. Alvarez said quickly. "They're on their way." But she hesitated, eyes darting to the stairwell. "There's something wrong with his skin." Before Daniel could ask what she meant, a heavy slam echoed from above. Then a sound that made the hair rise on the back of his neck. A guttural snarl, animalistic, yet unmistakably human. Mrs. Alvarez stepped back. That wasn't a man's voice. Daniel felt it too. The apartment building, old and cramped, seemed to shrink around them, the very air tightening with dread. From the stairwell came the sound of footsteps. But they weren't steady. They were fast, too fast. And whatever it was coming down. Silhouettes. That was a word that Elias kept thinking about as the group huddled together in the dim glow of a dying lantern. The forest was alive with sound. Yet every rustle in the branches and every crunch in the soil made it feel like something was pacing around them, just beyond the thin veil of light. The strangers, 15 in total, watched Elias carefully. Their eyes were hollow with exhaustion, cheeks thin from hunger, and bodies marked with scratches and bruises. They looked like people who had been running for weeks, maybe months. The woman who had spoken first earlier, tall with streaks of gray in her otherwise dark hair, introduced herself as Marin. She carried a crossbow slung across her back, though the string looked frayed. Beside her, a broad-shouldered man named Dallin held a metal pipe that had been sharpened crudely at the end. The others had equally makeshift weapons, sticks, rusted knives, broken farming tools. They were survivors, but barely. Elias swallowed hard. His underground shelter, hidden beneath the old cabin ruins, had enough food, water, and heat for one man. Maybe two. But 15? He knew immediately that it would never be enough. Yet something in Marin's eyes told him he couldn't just turn them away. "What did you mean?" Elias asked, voice low. "When you said the cities are gone?" Marin's lips tightened. The group shifted uneasily. Finally, Dallin spoke. "They came from the skies," he said. "Not like meteors, not like anything natural. They dropped as if placed. Giants. Their skin is like obsidian. They move only when sound touches the air. Sensitive to sound," Marin added, almost whispering. "Every scream, every footstep, every word spoken too loudly. It draws them. And when they come, you don't run. You don't fight. You hide or you die. A shiver coursed through Elias. He had heard distant thunder like rumbles in the forest before, but he had dismissed them as storms rolling across the mountains. Now he wasn't so sure. One of the younger survivors, a boy who couldn't have been older than 16, interrupted. His eyes were wide, his voice trembling. They don't just hear sound. They feel it. The air shifts when you move. Even breathing too hard can bring them. Marin shot him a glare. Enough, Kieran. But Elias could see the truth in the boy's eyes. The kind of truth that had been carved into him by terror. Elias exhaled slowly, then asked the question that had been sitting heavy in his chest since they arrived. Why come here? Why find me? Marin stepped forward. Her boots crunched softly in the soil, each sound making the group collectively tense. Because we were told someone lived out here, she said. Someone with shelter. And if that someone is still alive, it means they know how to survive the giants. Elias's jaw clenched. They were desperate, and desperation made people dangerous. He turned toward the barely visible outline of the cabin ruins. Follow me, quietly. The group obeyed, moving with painstaking care, each step deliberate. Elias led them to the collapsed remains of the old cabin. Beneath the rubble, hidden under a heavy slab of stone, was a concealed entrance to his underground shelter. He knelt, pulling it open, the sound echoing faintly in the night. The group winced at the noise, eyes darting toward the forest, as though expecting something massive to burst through the trees. Inside, Elias urged. One by one, they descended into the shelter. The space was cramped, lined with shelves stocked with jars, tins, and containers. A small generator hummed softly in the corner, giving off a faint light. Elias had carved this place with his own hands, preparing for years of solitude. Now, with 15 strangers filling the air, it suddenly felt unbearably small. When the last of them entered, Elias sealed the hatch shut, shutting out the night. But the silence inside was not comforting. It was suffocating. Marin looked at him with something between gratitude and calculation. You've saved us, she said. Elias wasn't so sure. Above them, in the dark expanse of the forest, something vast stirred. The earth trembled faintly, as though a mountain had shifted in its sleep. And somewhere in the shadows, the giants had heard. The silence of the night hummed in Elias's ears. When he shut the heavy door of the underground shelter, the noise of the outside world vanished at once. Above, the cursed footsteps of the giants still sent faint tremors through the earth, but here, behind thick walls, he tried to convince himself he was safe. The shelter was a broad chamber carved beneath the ground. Shelves were lined with jars, dried food, and barrels of drinking water. Along the walls rested old radios, fuel cans, a few rifles, and boxes of ammunition. Elias had been preparing for a long time. The world had already collapsed. The cities were gone, yet he believed no one would ever find him in the depths of the forest. At least, until last night. He sat at the table, spreading out the hand-drawn map he had made himself. He marked the direction from which the giants had come. Then he set the pencil down and rubbed his forehead. His breath was uneven, his heart still pounding hard. A faint tapping at the door jolted him upright. His hand darted toward the rifle. The sound resisted, soft, metallic, as if something delicate were pressing against the steel. But it wasn't the sound of giants. It was lighter, more human. Elias drew a deep breath, then shouted with a trembling voice, "Who's there?" Silence. Then, from the other side of the door, a voice rose. "Please, open the door." Elias's throat tightened. It was a young woman's voice. Moments later, more voices followed, one thin and childlike, another deep and male. A group of people, perhaps survivors from the forest, or perhaps a trap, struggling to steady his heartbeat. He called out, "How many of you?" A pause. Then the answer, 15 of us. We escaped the city. You must protect us." Elias's palms dampened with sweat. 15. Far too many. If he let them in, his supplies would vanish quickly. If he refused, they would be slaughtered by the giants outside. The cry of a child echoed beyond the steel. Elias clenched his teeth, torn between suspicion and mercy. At last, He pulled down the lever. The heavy door creaked open. The first to enter was a young woman, eyes wide with fear, clutching a small child in her arms. Behind her came an old man, then a wounded youth, and then the rest. The chamber filled with strangers, 15 souls now bound to Elias's world. But one among them held Elias's gaze longer than the rest, as if studying him, measuring him. In that look, Elias felt something he could not name, something that smelled of danger. When he closed the door again, he knew there was no turning back. They lingered at the edges of Elias's vision, never solid, never clear, like smoke that refused to disperse. The night was utterly silent now. Even the distant rumble of the giant's footsteps had faded into nothingness, leaving behind an emptiness that was somehow louder than sound itself. Elias stood beneath the half-broken sign that read, or, the missing letters swallowed by rust and time. He brushed the snow from its surface, revealing just enough to spark a memory, a settlement he had once heard about, a place erased from maps after the invasion. The stories had been vague, fragmented whispers traded by survivors. A village swallowed in one night, no bodies ever found, only abandoned homes with fires still burning in their hearts. Some said it had been the first place the creatures tested their silence. Others said the people had simply walked into the forest and never come back. Now Elias realized he was standing at its threshold, his breath misted in the air, too loud, too heavy. Every inhalation felt like a beacon, calling out into the dark. He tightened the straps of his pack, forcing his trembling hands to still and step forward. The ground was littered with broken furniture, overturned carts, and the faint impression of footprints long since iced over. Yet no bones, no clothes, no trace of the people who had lived here. It was as if the village had exhaled its inhabitants, scattering them like ash on the wind. Elias felt it before he saw it. That crushing awareness of being observed. A presence. Not the lumbering attention of the giants, but something sharper, more deliberate. His pulse quickened, and he ducked into the shadow of a collapsed roof, peering into the street. At first, nothing, just snowflakes drifting in lazy spirals. Then movement. A tall figure, too thin, too still. Its face caught the pale moonlight, but the features shifted, blurred, as if refusing to settle into one identity. Elias's mouth went dry. This was not one of the giants. This was something else. The figure tilted its head, not like a curious animal, but like someone rehearsing a gesture they had seen humans make, but never quite understood. Then it began to walk toward him, soundless, each step sinking into the snow without the faintest crunch. Elias's instinct screamed. He stumbled back into the ruined building, every muscle in his body taut, knowing without reason that whatever this thing was, it wasn't meant to exist in daylight. And it wasn't alone. From the corners of shattered windows, from behind the splintered remains of doors, more figures began to emerge, their faces blurred, their bodies just slightly wrong in proportion. They did not rush him. They simply stood there, surrounding him, their silence pressing like a weight on his chest. Elias gripped the hilt of his knife. It felt pitifully small in his hand. Somewhere in the night, the giants roared again, and for the first time, Elias realized the sound wasn't a rage. It was warning. Shadows stretched unnaturally across the trees, longer than they should have been under the pale moonlight. Elias followed the group cautiously, his boots crunching against the cold, brittle soil. No one spoke. The only sounds were the distant creaks of the forest and the occasional groan of shifting wood. The silence was broken when one of the men, a tall, broad-shouldered figure named Carlin, stopped abruptly and raised his hand. Everyone froze. Elias squinted ahead and saw it. A massive indentation in the earth, a footprint. It was larger than anything he had ever imagined. The ground around it was shattered, as though immense weight had pressed down with violent force. God above, Carlin muttered. The leader of the group, a scarred woman named Mirela, crouched to examine the track. Fresh, she whispered. Not more than an hour old. Elias's stomach twisted. He wanted to ask why they were following these creatures at all, but something in Mirela's eyes told him the answer would be worse than his fears. They weren't just avoiding the monsters. They were hunting them. As they pressed deeper into the forest, Elias began to notice something strange. The air grew heavier, colder, as if every breath he drew was sinking into his chest. The trees thinned, revealing a clearing littered with bones. Human bones. They were scattered haphazardly, cracked open as though something had feasted on the marrow. The group exchanged uneasy glances. Suddenly, a sound split the silence. A low, resonant rumble, like the growl of a storm contained within a throat. Elias's knees buckled. From a tree lean, a colossal silhouette shifted, its outline jagged and unnatural. Mirela lifted her weapon slowly. "It's here," she breathed. Elias wanted to run, to disappear into the darkness, but his legs felt like stone. The creature stepped forward, its body towering over them, its form impossible to comprehend. Neither beast nor man, but something ancient, something designed for a world that was not theirs. Its skin glistened like obsidian, and its face, if it could be called a face, shimmered with dozens of moving shapes, like trapped souls pressing against the surface, screaming silently. The ground trembled. The group raised their weapons, but Elias knew in his heart. No blade, no bullet could kill something born outside the laws of nature. And yet, Mirela smiled. Not a smile of courage, but one of grim understanding. As the monster leaned forward, Elias realized a terrible truth. They hadn't stumbled upon this thing. They had led him to it. Hunger gnawed at Elias more than fear now. He hadn't eaten since before the group arrived, and the silence that wrapped the forest only deepened the sense of isolation. The 15 strangers whispered among themselves, arguing in hushed tones about what to do next. Some wanted to keep moving. Others insisted they should hide underground with him. Elias studied them carefully. Their faces, pale in the cold moonlight, carried the same haunted look. The look of people who had seen the world collapse. A man named Karen, tall and wiry with sunken eyes, finally spoke louder than the others. "We cannot stay here. Those things, whatever they are, move faster than we do. We need to find higher ground, someplace safe." "Safe," Elias muttered, shaking his head. "There is no safe anymore. That's why I built this place. You think climbing a hill will keep them from hearing your heartbeats." The group quieted, uneasy with his words. One of the younger women, probably no older than 20, stared at Elias with wide, frightened eyes. "Then what are they?" she whispered. Elias swallowed, his throat dry. He didn't want to say it, didn't want to give the things shape through words. But the group deserved an answer. "They're not creatures," he said slowly. "Not in the way you think. They don't belong here. They came from the sky." Murmurs rippled through the group. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others clenched their jaws in silent terror. Karen narrowed his eyes. "Aliens? That's what you're telling us?" "That giants walked out of stars." "They didn't walk," Elias corrected him. "They were sent. Dropped here, maybe. I've heard them, their movements, their rhythm. It's too precise, too controlled." The young woman covered her ears as if the very thought was unbearable. Another man muttered, "Then why here? Why us?" Elias's gaze drifted to the forest beyond, where shadows shifted with every gust of wind. His stomach twisted, but it wasn't hunger anymore. It was realization. "They're cleansing," he said. "That's their purpose, to wipe us away." A heavy silence fell. The fire crackled, and somewhere far off, a deep, resonant boom echoed, like a footfall. The group stiffened. One by one, their eyes turned to Elias, not with trust, but with suspicion. They wanted answers, guidance, maybe even hope. But Elias knew the truth offered none of that. "They will come again tonight," he said. "And if you stay above ground, you won't live to see the morning." Reflections wavered across the broken shards of a mirror lying on the floor of Elias's underground shelter. He had kept the mirror hidden beneath a cloth for years, avoiding it except for rare moments when he needed to remind himself that he was still human. Tonight, though, something compelled him to uncover it. His face stared back, thinner than he remembered, pale from years of avoiding sunlight. His eyes had changed too. They seemed sharper, more alert, as though some part of him was always watching the shadows for movement. But what unsettled him most wasn't his own reflection. It was the fleeting glimpses of something else. When he moved slightly, just enough for the candlelight to flicker across the glass, he saw them. Shapes, figures in the background that shouldn't have been there. At first, he thought they were illusions born of his exhaustion, but then one of them blinked. Elias staggered back, nearly knocking over the candle. His breath caught in his throat as he leaned forward again. The mirror was no longer reflecting only him. It showed a landscape he recognized all too well. The forest above, shrouded in mist, and between the trees, colossal shadows. Giants. They weren't in the room with him, yet the mirror presented them as though they could step into his shelter at any moment. Their massive forms bent unnaturally, moving to the fog in jerky silence. The glass trembled, as if the barrier between their world and his was thinning. Elias pressed his hand against a mirror. For a brief instant, the cold glass rippled like water. His heart hammered. Could this be a gateway? A warning? Or worse, had the giants always been closer than he realized? A knock echoed from the heavy steel door above. 3 deliberate thuds. Elias froze. The sound was muffled by layers of earth and metal, but it was real. No one should know of this place. He had told no one. He turned back the mirror, hoping for answers, but the reflection had changed again. Now, instead of the forest, he saw the inside of his shelter, only not as it was. The reflected shelter was darker, with walls damp and dripping as though water seeped from unseen cracks. And in the reflection, Elias wasn't alone. Behind his mirrored self stood figures, 15 of them, the survivors he had met. They were staring directly into the mirror, their faces pale, their eyes hollow. Their lips moved in unison, though no sound emerged. Elias's chest tightened. He stumbled backward, clutching at the candle. The flame sputtered, nearly dying. Then came another knock on the steel door, louder this time, as if the visitor knew he was inside. Slowly, the figures in the mirror lifted their arms, pointing toward the door. Their mouths opened wider, as though screaming silently. And behind them, the giants leaned down, their massive faces pressing close to the glass, their eyes like pits of endless night. Elias staggered, torn between 2 horrors, the knocking that grew more insistent above him, and the mirror that seemed to be pulling him closer, urging him to step through. The final knock wasn't a knock at all. It was a thunderous slam that rattled the shelter's frame. The mirror cracked down the middle, and through the splintered glass, Elias swore he saw something move, something stepping forward. Hunger gnawed at Elias and the others, a constant ache that seemed to hollow out their stomachs and twist their minds. The underground shelter had food, stacked neatly on dusty shelves, but the air itself felt poisoned by silence and fear. Each bite tasted stale, like ashes clinging to their tongues. Mara sat cross-legged on the floor, turning a can of beans over in her hands without opening it. Her face was pale, her lips chapped. She whispered, "It doesn't matter how much we eat. We'll never be full here." The others shifted uneasily. One of the men, a former soldier named Ren, finally slammed his fist on the table. "We're not starving because of the food. We're starving because we're trapped." Elias studied him. Ren's words rang true. This wasn't a hunger that came from the body alone. It was deeper, older, something that pressed on him from the walls, from the tunnels above, from the earth itself. It was as if the forest and its creatures had left a mark, and now the shelter amplified it. At night, the hunger grew worse. Elias would wake up with his teeth grinding, his nails digging into his palms. He dreamed of tearing raw flesh with his hands, of biting into warm, dripping meat. He would wake drenched in sweat, the taste of copper in his mouth. On the 3rd night, one of the group disappeared. A young man named Corin had been sleeping closest to the heavy metal door. In the morning, his bedroll was empty, a trail of damp footprints leading back into the tunnel. No one had seen him leave, and no one wanted to follow. "They're calling us," Mara said flatly, her eyes sunken. "The hunger doesn't belong to us. It belongs to them. And now it's spreading." Elias wanted to deny it, but his own body betrayed him. His stomach churned with a craving that food could never satisfy. He licked his lips, staring at the others too long, until they noticed and shifted away from him. That night, the sound returned, deep, thundering steps above, slow and patient, circling the hidden shelter like predators testing a cage. The walls groaned with each vibration, dust sifting from the ceiling. And under the footsteps came a sound worse than hunger itself. Breathing. Slow, vast inhalations that made the air in their lungs feel stolen. "They know we're here," Ren whispered, his hand trembling on his rifle. Elias clenched his jaw, heart hammering. He knew Ren was wrong. The creatures didn't just know where they were. They were waiting for the hunger to finish its work. The heavy steel door above them groaned, vibrating with force that made the floor tremble beneath Elias and the others. Each breath they drew seemed louder than the last, every heartbeat like a drum announcing their presence to the unseen giants. Elias gripped the edge of the table, knuckles white. His eyes darted toward the shadows where the group huddled together, fear etched on every face. The hunger that had been gnawing at them for days now felt secondary to the terror pressing from above. A deep, resonant slam echoed through the shelter, shaking the walls. Dust rained down from the ceiling, and Mara let out a strangled scream. Elias moved to the door, placing his ear against the cold metal. The sound above was no longer footsteps. It was deliberate, patient, calculated. "They're testing it," Elias whispered, his voice trembling. "They're seeing if we react." Suddenly, the vibration stopped. Silence returned, heavier than before, suffocating in its intensity. The group held their breath, waiting, listening. Then, slowly, the shadows at the edges of the shelter began to shift. Shapes emerged, not giants, but the figures from the mirror. The 15 survivors they had brought inside. Only their faces were distorted, twisted versions of themselves. Elias staggered back. "No, this isn't real," he muttered. But the figures advanced, moving silently across the floor. Their eyes were black pits, mouths opening impossibly wide in silent screams. One reached toward Elias. He stumbled backward, crashing into the table, knocking over a lantern. Flames flickered, casting dancing shadows across the room. The steel door rattled again, this time violently. The giants above were no longer patient. They were hungry. Elias realizing that the mirror had been a warning, a bridge. The creatures, the distorted figures, were not confined to reflections. They could cross over. In a desperate move, Elias grabbed a fire extinguisher and swung at the nearest figure. The contact produced a hollow sound, like striking mist, and the form dissipated into shadows. But more were coming, their numbers seemingly endless. The door above shuddered, metal bending, and with a final, deafening slam, it burst inward. Snow and debris poured into the shelter as a shadow larger than any building eclipsed the dim lantern light. The giants had entered. Elias raised his arms instinctively, screaming, but no sound left his mouth. The hunger, the fear, the isolation, all converged into a single, paralyzing weight. The last thing he saw before the darkness consumed him was a reflection of his own distorted face in a shard of broken mirror on the floor. And then there was nothing.